African Development Bank's 59th annual meeting and the 50th meeting of the Board of Governors of the African Development Fund will take place at the Kenyatta International Conference Center in Nairobi from the 27th till the 31st of May 2024.
Kenya was selected by the Boards of Governors to host the 2024 annual meetings following its expression of interest to do so and after a determination by an evaluation mission from the bank that the country has the capacity to host the meetings.
This year's theme is Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. Professor Vincent Emehele, the group's Secretary General, and Kevin Urama, Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance, addressed journalists on Wednesday, April 3rd during a press conference ahead of its annual meetings.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, good morning here in Abidjan, good afternoon wherever you may be, and possibly good evening somewhere else. My name is Vincent Emehele, Secretary General of the African Development Bank Group. I'm joined here by my colleagues, Professor Kevin Urama, Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management, and Mr. Solomon Mugera, Director of Communications of the bank. As you may be aware, the African Development Bank Group consists of a number of entities, primarily the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund, with the Nigeria Trust Fund and as well as other trust funds forming part of the entity. The bank and the fund have separate governance organs. In other words, they have separate boards of governance as well as separate boards of directors. On the other hand, the Nigeria Trust Fund is a special trust fund of the bank and therefore does not have a separate governance organ and is overseen by the board of directors of the bank. As Secretary General of the Bank Group, I am Secretary to the respective boards of governance of the bank and the fund, as well as the boards of directors of both. It is in this capacity that I wish to share with you, the press, some pertinent information with regard to the 2024 annual meetings, which is the foremost statutory event on the governance calendar of the African Development Bank Group this year. For these particular annual meetings, we expect upward of up to 4,000 participants at the meetings.
In his address, Emehele said the bank's governors would engage with the president of the African Development Bank to explore ways in which the bank and other multilateral development banks could respond to the call to work together to significantly scale up resources for the sustainable development of the continent.
During the meetings, the boards of governors, as the highest decision-making and oversight organs of the bank and the fund, will review the annual report on the finances, operations, and other activities of the bank and the fund during the preceding financial year. The governors will then adopt resolutions on key decisions and conclusions of the annual meetings. There will also be a governors' dialogue, which will provide a platform for governors to interact and engage with the president of the bank group and senior management on issues of strategic significance to the continent and the bank. The proposed theme of the governors' dialogue is mobilizing the private sector to accelerate Africa's transformation. Given that this edition of the governors' dialogue will take place at a critical juncture when the continent continues to face a set of interlocking crises, the dialogue among various other areas will reflect on the bank group's new 10-year strategy that is aimed at accelerating Africa's transformation, explore ways in which the bank and other multilateral development banks could respond optimally to the call on them to work better together to significantly scale up resources for the sustainable development of the continent, and focus on the bank's role in mobilizing the private sector in the work of multilateral development banks within the context of the multilateral development bank's evolution for the purpose of accelerating Africa's development.
Elaborating on some of the key knowledge events to be held during the meetings structured around its theme, Kevin Urama said the presidential dialogue would bring heads of states and governors together to take stock of measures and reforms.
4 separate knowledge events that will be featured during the annual meetings
The first one will be the presidential dialogue, which will bring heads of states and government to have focused dialogue on the theme of the annual meetings, considering how Africa has fared in its transformation, the role of the African Development Bank in enhancing and fast-tracking that transformation, and what roles the emerging reforms in the global financial architecture could play in accelerating Africa's transformation. Then second, we will have a high-level event that will be the launch of the African Economic Outlook Report 2024, the annual report that shapes the compass of Africa's development that is produced by the African Development Bank annually. This year's theme for the African Economic Outlook Report will be Africa's transformation, the reform of the global financial architecture. Again, focusing on how Africa's transformation has fared, what have been the key drivers of this transformation, and what role the global financial architecture plays in that transformation of the African continent. In addition to this high-level knowledge event, we will feature two thematic events that are focusing on selected themes that, based on our research, are key to Africa's transformation. And one of them is financing Africa's transformation in a changing global financial system. In all our research, you find that financing has always remained one of the major constraints of accelerated transformation on the continent. So these particular knowledge events will bring global experts in the financial system to be able to look at how to finance Africa's transformation in the changing global financial system. Then the second thematic event will be driving it home to look at the role of Africa's natural resources and economic productivity in Africa. So that event will be on the theme measuring the green wealth of nations, natural capital, and economic productivity in Africa. So here we're going to be seeing how Africa's natural resources could actually help drive that transformation on the continent even better than it has in the preceding years over the decades that we have seen. And then, of course, there will be other events marking the 60th anniversary of the African Development Bank Group, as already clearly described by the Secretary General of the Bank Group.
The annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group comprise statutory meetings of its governors and knowledge events. Attendees will include representatives of bilateral and multilateral development agencies, leading academics and non-governmental organizations, civil society, and the private sector.
One notable thing about the 2024 annual meetings is that the African Development Bank turns 60 this year, which is a very significant milestone. As you may be aware, the agreement establishing the African Development Bank was signed by member states on 4 August 1963 in Khartoum, Sudan, and the agreement came into force on the 10th of September 1964. While commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the bank will be year-long, it will commence with a short event on day 3 of the annual meetings under the theme, The African Development Bank, 60 Years of Making a Difference. Other events whose details will be announced to the public in due course are planned across the continent in the course of the year, culminating in the actual anniversary date. You may want to find out what the theme of the annual meetings this year is. The theme for the annual meetings this year is Africa's Transformation, the African Development Bank, and the Reform of the Global Financial Architecture. And this theme is set against the realization that despite a sustained economic growth over 2 decades, Africa's economic transformation remains quite incomplete.
The meeting provides an opportunity for reflection on the African Development Bank Group's commitment to accomplishing its mission of developing the African continent and improving the lives of its people. This year's annual meetings will bring together more than 3,000 delegates and participants. This is the bank's most important event annually, allowing organizations to take stock of progress with its shareholders.
Africa's economies are growing, but debt and inequality persist. Natural resources are rich, but manufacturing industry and employment are declining. Development projects are abundant, but the resources provided by the current financial system are insufficient to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The global financial architecture needs to be reformed, and the African Development Bank Group has a critical role to play. Join us to fast-track Africa's transformation at the African Development Bank Group's annual meetings in Nairobi, Kenya from May 27th to 31st, 2024.